Hello and welcome. On behalf of the entire American Red Cross and our International Humanitarian Law Program, my name is Thomas Harper. I have the pleasure of serving as the Senior Legal Advisor in International Humanitarian Law for the American Red Cross. And I want to welcome each and every one of you and extend a warm welcome to our guest panelists as well. Thank you so much to each and every one of our panelists for graciously offering up their time, talent, and expertise to come speak on this really critical and very, very relevant topic of wartime protections of the environment. Day in and day out, as conflicts erupt and continue around the globe, this topic continues to show its relevancy and the need for continuing environmental protections and additional steps to supplement those protections is an ongoing effort, which you'll hear about from our guests today. I also want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here today. Our mission, our mandate as part of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement is to disseminate IHL. That's a mission that goes back to the very founding of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. And we are honored to be a modern day iteration, the latest chapter, so to speak, of that mission that began in 1859 on a battlefield in Solferino, Italy. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you Taya Anderson. Taya is our Henry P. Davison Fellow here at National Headquarters for the American Red Cross IHL team. And Taya is going to introduce our very first guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. It is my pleasure to have brought you this event. This is the focus of my fellowship, Protection of the Environment, or the cross-sections between IHL, the environment, and the climate. Our first speaker today is Doug Weir, who is the Research and Policy Director from CEOPS, the Conflict and Environment Observatory. He couldn't be with us today, but he has made this very special presentation for us so that we can get acquainted with the pathways to environmental harm in relation to armed conflict. And just to briefly introduce him, since he is not here to introduce himself, Doug Weir has undertaken research and advocacy on the polluting legacy of armed conflicts and military activities all the way back since 2005. He's a former coordinator of the International Coalition to Ban Uranium Weapons, and has later expanded his work to encompass conflict pollution and the toxic remnants of war, before establishing the Conflict and Environment Observatory to monitor and raise awareness of the environmental and derived humanitarian consequences of conflict. He holds degrees in geology and print journalism from Manchester and Sheffield universities, and is a visiting research fellow in the Department of Geography at King's College London. So all great reasons why we wanted him to make a presentation for us, even though he couldn't be here today. So enjoy.
Hi, my name is Doug Weir. I'm the Research and Policy Director of the Conflict Environment Observatory. And I just want to talk a little bit about how some of the environmental harm that we see in conflicts is not always straightforward. I think in the past, when we have looked at IHL, sometimes it can seem, at least at first glance, slightly simplistic about environmental harm, but it tends to focus on direct impacts. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this kind of reverberating impacts, but also how environmental risks are often quite deeply connected to the context in which these incidents happen. So I have a few from a number of countries, a number of conflicts, which talk through just to give this kind of sense, but it's often wider than just simple targeting decisions. So just a little bit about us. Conflict and Environment Observatory is a UK charity. We were launched to try and document environmental risks and communicate these environmental stories from conflicts, all to increase the profile and visibility of the environmental dimensions of conflicts, which obviously have humanitarian consequences for people. So just to talk, introduce where we tend to look at. So on this handy graph from the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, you can see the environment and conflict. It is this continuum. So there are environmental risks before conflict. We look at how minerals can drive conflict or finance conflict, for example. The environment features very much post-conflict. We tend to see, for example, these huge spikes in deforestation in countries with tropical forests post-conflict because you have this governance vacuum. So that was the case in Colombia, but it's also the case in many other places around the world. Our main focus tends to be in the middle of this chart. So in the red here, which is looking at how the environment is damaged by conflict, and also sometimes how the environment is weaponized in conflict. And that tends to be the main focus of what we look at and what I'll be talking about today. So then just a key question for us is like, why do we do what we do? And collecting environmental data is foundational to our work. It is the research which informs our policy, just as it is in any other sector. So the main focus of data collection is advocacy, to be able to talk to people like you, the public, stakeholders, policymakers, whatever you like to call them. And this is all because the environment has this low priority in the context of conflicts, even lower than humanitarian consequences. It's also about assessment. So if we can gather data during the conflict, it can help inform what happens next in terms of environmental remediation or restoration. It's about accountability, which there are very limited avenues at the moment towards accountability, but it's increasingly on the agenda. We've seen it a lot cropping up in the context of Ukraine. And then finally, it's around norm strengthening. So if we can understand how the environment is damaged in conflict, it means we can then help to inform the policy changes we need to see. And that's kind of the role which we played throughout the last sort of 10 years or so during the process to develop the PERAC principles, protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict. So we were able to bring observations and experience from the field, typically based on remote environmental monitoring, and share those with the legal experts who are working on the process. So just to give a few examples of this sometimes complex relationship of how the environment is affected in conflict and potentially how that then affects people. I'll start with an easy one, which is, very logical for ICRC, American Red Cross folk, and this looks at a bit of research we did with air wars, looking at a bombing campaign in November 2021 in Gaza. And as with a lot of the punitive campaigns in Gaza, there was a focus on trying to damage underground assets, tunnel systems and the like. So the weapons which Israel use tend to be able to penetrate the ground. And it's not just tunnels that are underneath the ground, but it's also pipe work and infrastructure for wash infrastructure. So wastewater pipes, water pipes. And we were able to look at a number of locations around Gaza where we saw damage to wastewater plants and also to wastewater infrastructure, leading to environmental contamination with untreated sewage. And this obviously creates immediate risks for health issues, spread of disease in communities, but also because Gaza has, it's based on very permeable bedrock. Its aquifer is highly relied on for the people of Gaza. This also presents these risks of contamination for the already quite polluted water underneath Gaza, which millions of Gazans rely on a day-to-day basis. And it's not just an issue of contamination within Gaza itself, but we also see contamination and pollution with wastewater along the coastline. And that's what happens when your wastewater treatment plants are working ineffectively. You tend to have raw sewage pumped directly out into the sea. And so here on the left, you can see where contaminated water, wastewater, was being discharged along the coastline and also heading south towards the Israeli coast. So this is something which is very close, obviously, to the habitat work that the Red Cross does generally. Okay. The second example is one of an indirect or reverberating impact. And this is based on research undertaken by the Dutch NGO PAX. What you're looking at here are artisanal oil fields. So each of these little black lines is a trench buried in the desert where oil is being refined by people. Around 2015, 2016, during the conflict in Syria, you had Russia and the West bombing oil infrastructure in Syria, and the loss of that domestic refining capacity had an impact on the local population. You also saw oil being used as a means of making money because it wasn't available because the oil refining systems had been knocked out. And so you ended up with this huge surge in artisanal oil refining, and essentially it's getting crude oil, putting it in a huge burner, heating it up until it fractionates, and you can divide up the diesel, petrol, waxes. The problem is you then have these areas of the desert, often quite in close proximity to agricultural areas or to settlements, where you have air pollution, which is ongoing, and you also have high levels of soil pollution and potentially groundwater pollution. Now, interestingly, there were decisions taken around the targeting of this oil infrastructure, which, as far as they were concerned, some of those being held by Islamic State, some by the Syrian government. They were deemed militarily useful objects to destroy. They're high-value targets. They contributed to the war effort. But because of the destruction of these refineries, it then led indirectly to this sort of spread, almost cancer-like spread of this artisanal oil refining across the area. So what would have been a localized environmental issue around these oil refineries or oil pumping stations which were hit, then has this much wider geographical effect, because society, the communities there, they needed oil for heating, they needed oil for driving, and that oil has to come from somewhere. So still on the question of oil, this is something which you're probably familiar with from the paper. It's been a bit of a cause célèbre. This is the FSO Safa oil storage terminal off Yemen. So it's a converted supertanker. It's about the same age I am. It has a single hull, which oil tankers don't have anymore because it's deemed too dangerous. They have double thickness hulls. It's permanently moored in place off a place called Ras Isa, off the coast of Yemen, and a pipeline which extracted oil from the interior of Yemen is linked to this vessel. Ships used to come alongside, take the oil from it and export it for refining overseas. Since 2015, this vessel hasn't been looked after. It's had a skeleton crew, but because of the conflict, lack of access, lack of fuel, it's basically just been sitting there rusting, and it still contains 1.14 million barrels of oil, which is somewhat over 4 times the amount of oil which was spilled in the Exxon Valdez disaster in Alaska. This then creates something of a problem, potentially. One of the key issues here is that these oil tankers, they pump inert gas like nitrogen into their fuel tanks, and that stops the volatile gases which evaporate from stored crude oil from building up. This hasn't happened here for years. So potentially in these oil storage tanks, you have large volumes of potentially explosive gases. Now, if you had a catastrophic spill or a fire, you could have a huge fire which would rain out pollution onto some of the most important agricultural areas along the Yemeni coast. You would have a huge spill which could contaminate coastal aquifers. It would also close the port of Hodeida in Yemen, which is one of the main access points for humanitarian aid. It would also completely disrupt shipping in the Red Sea, and it would also have a significant environmental impact. And what we see when we look at the context of where the Safa is moored, so it's permanently moored in this site, you can see it down here at the bottom. It's also in very close proximity to Camaran Island, which is one of Yemen's only ostensibly marine protected areas. It has very rich mangroves. There are coral reefs around. All these would be at risk from a catastrophic spill from the FSO Safa. And it's been interesting looking at the contours of attention and response on this issue, that this is one of the few environmental issues which has made it to the UN Security Council. States have queued up to say what a terrible problem it is, how something needs to be done. Funding rounds have gone round, and just last week, an alternative vessel arrived in Djibouti as part of a salvage operation for oil to be pumped off. But the UN still needs more money to be able to finish this job. And what we've seen is that states who've spent vast sums on the humanitarian response, vast sums arming belligerents and parties to the conflict, when it comes to the around $120 million needed for this salvage operation to prevent a disaster which would cost potentially $20 billion or more to deal with, it's been very, very difficult for them to get this money together, to the point where the UN has already launched a public crowdfunding campaign, which is a strange situation to be in and not necessarily a particularly useful precedent. Moving on from Yemen. So this is a stretch of a Libyan coastline just near Benghazi. Benghazi was very, very severely damaged by the use of explosive weapons in the early stages of the invasion. Massive levels of damage to the urban infrastructure. Up here on the left is the Mediterranean. So this is a coastal strip, a beach, actually like a salt pan, salt flat along the beach, quite an important area, ecologically quite close to a nature reserve. And this lobed structure coming down here is a landfill site. And in Libya, it's quite common for waste to be dumped in uncontrolled landfills. And because of the sheer level of destruction that you had in Benghazi, it created vast amounts of debris and waste, so pulverized buildings, essentially everything that was in them when they're damaged by artillery or air-launched weapons. And so what we see from this use of explosive weapons not only does it have a direct humanitarian impact, causing death and destruction, knocking out essential services in these towns and cities, but also the waste and debris has to be dealt with somewhere. And typically the volumes are so large that it doesn't tend to be managed properly. And here we have in Benghazi, all this stuff being driven down to the local beach and dumped essentially. And you can look at this spot on Google Earth over the years and see these lobes of waste and debris slowly expanding as time goes by, as more of the material which was damaged or destroyed or generated in Benghazi is dumped in this foreshore area. So from Libya, we'll go to Ukraine and another important ecological area. This is photos taken in May 2022. And as you can see, we have a series of fires along here. So this is the Kinburn Spit in South Kherson, so in the south of Ukraine, and it's an area which remains under Russian occupation at the moment and was under Russian occupation at the time. The spit here on the left, where some of the large fires are, this is very close to Mykolaiv and other ports, so it's strategically quite important. From here you can bombard various locations. What we had was a series of wildfires, far more intense than they usually are in this season. Along this area, we also have a number of protected areas. So this is everything from a UNESCO World Heritage Site to a number of different protected areas with different degrees and levels of protection. So not only do we have a number of fires which were caused by the impact points from weapons, but also at the firing points from heavy weapons. So if you're launching rockets, for example, it's quite often that you also set fire to the landscape that you're in. But because it was under occupation, the normal firefighting which would have taken place didn't take place. So this area is not immune to forest fires or landscape fires. They tend to happen most summers, but the intensity and number of them in 2022 was much higher than in previous years because they weren't being stopped and because you had these additional sources of fires. So this has impacted some quite important and quite fragile habitats along this area. The final example is another one from Ukraine. So this is the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol, which you may recall was for 2 months the center of attention and almost the focus of the conflict as the Ukrainian military made a last stand within this complex. So it's a huge steelworks, goes back about 80, 90 years. The site is enormous, has a number of quite problematic locations and sites in it because of the different industrial processes which went on there. And often when we think about sort of the conventional IHL thinking of don't bomb that factory because it might cause an environmental problem, actually what we had in Mariupol was a far more complex and layered situation. So we had a hazardous industrial object which became this redoubt, a last stand for the Ukrainian military. There were also a couple of hundred civilians in bunkers underneath the facility. Because it was a military object, it could be argued, then Russia sought to attack it, and for weeks on end they were throwing pretty much everything they had at this site. And so when we look at social media monitoring, we can see a range of different potentially risky locations on this site which have been damaged. So from substations, from lime kilns to particular warehouses. Its landfill was on fire. We had this huge tailings pile right on the coast of the Sea of Azov, where you have slope stability from explosive weapons going into it. On many occasions, we had fires from particular industrial sites. The degree of damage to the whole area has been absolutely astonishing. And it's been everything from air-launched bombs to mortars, artillery to incendiary weapons. So use of thermite incendiary weapons, as you can see in this bottom image. And I guess what it's been a good example of is that in these contexts, it's not just simply a case of they damage the factory, it's caused pollution. Actually, the factory has become part and parcel of the conflict. It's been taken on far more of a sort of three-dimensional life than kind of a simple two-dimensional reading through a legal analysis would initially suggest. So yeah, I will leave it there. It's just a bit of an introduction. There's a lot more in all these cases and all these contexts on our website. But yeah, it's just something to bear in mind and consider that when we look at the environmental narratives which we see in conflict, they often tend to be yeah, a lot more complex than initially might see, and that then poses quite big challenges in terms of how we respond to them and also how we seek to minimize them or address their effects in future, or even to understand their humanitarian consequences as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
So I kind of want to thank Doug, but since he's not here, I'll leave it at, I'm really glad that you got to see that presentation, giving you some more context to how complex and multidimensional it can be to protect the environment in relation to armed conflict, and giving you a really good background for the couple of panels that we're going to have now. First one is going to be a panel that is focused on environmental protection during armed conflict, and specifically narrowing in on data collection and the obligations of parties. And then later in the program, we'll talk about post-conflict. What are the consideration and concerns there? As a brief introduction of our panelists, I will just give you their names and affiliation, and then they will give a further elaboration on their backgrounds and give some introductory remarks before we go into moderated questions. And then hopefully we'll be able to get to a couple of questions from the audience as well. So use that Q&A box. Some of the questions in the chat might get lost, but we'll try to pick them out wherever we can find them. So this first panel, we're going to have Wim Zeinberg, who is the project leader on humanitarian disarmament from PAX. And we will have Marty Bradley, who's a professor at the University of Johannesburg, joining us to discuss this very important topic. I'll give it over to Wim first to introduce himself with some remarks, and then Marty following.
Hi, and good morning or afternoon here, but morning there. Thanks, first of all, to the American Red Cross for inviting us and talk about our work. I'll share my screen for the quick presentation. Let me see. It's always a hassle to find out. Actually, I don't think oh yeah, here we go. With a different let's see. And I hope if I share it, it doesn't go to presentation mode. It does, but that's fine. You can still see all the pictures. So yeah, my name is Wim Zeinberg. I work at PAX. We're a Dutch peace organization, and been working on the environmental dimensions of armed conflicts since 2009, mostly in the Middle East, but also more recently on South Sudan and of course in Ukraine. And I'm also a contributor to the open source research collective Bellingcat. And the reason what I'm going to talk about today is how we can actually understand what the impacts of conflicts are, and how data has been very key in sort of showing the complexity and multitude of those kind of conflicts. You already saw Doug alluding to it, and it's really good to see that organizations such as his have been inspired by our data work. So, but we have to go back a little bit to this complex understanding in where we were working on in Iraq in 2000. tend to understand like what are the health concerns. And actually the ICRC was one of the organizations we were back working then with in Iraq, because they were approached by local communities over concerns over depleted uranium, which is a low-level radioactive waste. It's a heavy metal which is used in ammunitions, and the US fired it a lot in the different Gulf wars, and people were hearing about it, and they were afraid they were exposed to it, and they thought they were getting sick from it. And also our local partners wanted to understand like what was happening and how it could be linked to conflict pollution, those kind of health concerns. And also the IRC was approached by that, and we discussed back then. I was traveling to Basra and discussing it with them. And then while working in southern Iraq, you can also see how complex and how multi-factor the environmental threats are to people in conflict-affected areas. So it's very difficult to say, oh, this particular element results in the health effects of data. But we didn't have any firing coordinates from the US on where they have used it to see if we can make a link between exposure and health concerns. But during the work there, we trying to build, like we saw the different impacts there. And in 2011, 2012, when the war in Syria escalated very rapidly into a full-blown war, and in particular 2014, in the period 2012, 2015, the access to the internet and smartphones really took a huge spike. And this was interesting because people were posting videos and photos of what's happening in conflict areas. And back then, Bellingcat and his predecessor were already documenting human rights violations with barrel bombs, chemical weapon strikes, which we used to triangulate and geolocate where it was. So I thought, like, what if we use that same technique and look at what kind of industrial sites were hit during the war? What do we know about certain sites, what's stored there, and what could be the environmental health risk or pollution risk from those things being bombed? So, and also at the same time, Earth observation took a huge development. So open data platforms were using NASA data and the European Space Agency Sentinel system, which is a whole wide constellation of satellites with freely available imagery that have like a turnaround of every 5 days. It's like medium resolution imagery, but we're posting it online and make it fairly easily accessible for amateurs like myself. And that was very helpful in bringing all these tools together and to looking at what kind of impacts they could have. So we also use at the same time these open source tools, like the massive amount of public data from like social media platforms, special websites tracking marine vessels, airplanes, data platforms with Earth observation data from all kinds of satellites, high resolution, medium resolution, low resolution. It's all helpful. And we could combine all that to build a better picture. Like I said, you can sort of see it as sort of environmental jigsaw. And prior to that development, it was mostly UN Environment doing post-conflict assessments and releasing that, but they only did it when they had funding available, and often they did it quite late or it was limited. And now we have like almost near real-time information available to a broad audience that could use it. So here in the bottom, you see a couple of examples where I use different snapshots from so back in 2017, 2018, there were a lot of wildfires breaking out in Iraq, and they were linked with increased heat, with droughts, but also with armed groups like ISIS placing incendiary bombs into the crop fields, deliberately burning down crops. So we could track all that, and we could see like the impact on agricultural fields from those kind of devices, and also try look at what the total destruction was of agricultural on the agriculture. So throughout the last 10 years, we used that method, like combining open source information, satellite imagery, and open source information to look at very different aspects. So the first one we brought out in 2015 was looking in Syria, looking at the environmental risk from the different conflict impacts, looking at oil industry. The second one is the one that Dark Alert referenced to, the Scorched Earth and Charred Lives report, where we look specifically at the makeshift oil refineries, which was later followed up with field research, where we went to northeast Syria and visited location. The Living on the Black Sky report really looks at oil pollution and broader issues, conflict pollution in Iraq from the fight against ISIS and the destruction ISIS brought on the environment in Iraq. And what I mentioned earlier, like the River of Death report looked at like the degrading oil infrastructure in Syria that resulted in leaks that like in a post-conflict situation where leaks from pipelines, weak governance because of the political situation. So northeast Syria is currently controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is like a Kurdish-led armed group, and which has been supported by the US to fight ISIS, and it's currently in control of the area. But Turkey considered it as a sort of offshoot of the PKK and sort of limits the political recognition of the area itself, and therefore also is hampering like getting reconstruction aid to the area and putting pressure on the EU not to work with those groups because they consider them terrorists. At the same time, people in the area very much struggle with all the conflict impacts because there's no reconstruction aid going in there, and it has a big oil industry which was severely damaged. And as a result, you have all this crumbling infrastructure and pollution and more other water issues as well. In the this year, we launched a massive report looking at deforestation in Syria, particularly in the west of the country, where fuel needs, in particular for cooking and heating, over the last decade has been increased. The people didn't have access to gasoline or to kerosene for heating, so there was a massive deforestation taking place. So prior to the war, 3% of all Syria's land was covered with forest, in particular in Latakia and Homs, Hama, Aleppo. We found that over 40% of all the forest in Syria has been cut in the 12 years, mostly in the west, but also nature reserves have been cut down. Particular areas with natural forest in Aleppo, massive cut down of commercial trees, in particular in Palmyra and some other areas around Damascus, the green belt around Damascus. So that's where helpful to understand like what these sort of the long-term consequences are from the conflict. And just actually yesterday we launched a new report looking at flooding in South Sudan and oil infrastructure, and we've seen like the 2013 civil war had a serious impact on oil infrastructure. The fighting of these kind of areas, the weak governance, and now combined with increased flooding, which can be linked with the climate crisis, and weak oversight of those kind of environmental sensitive infrastructures, resulting in, apart from the grave humanitarian consequences of the flooding, now local communities are afraid that like wastewater pits which are flooded with which are affected during the flood is affecting livestock, and it's again we use open source and satellite imagery to detect all these kind of impacts. We also do like small snapshot work, so we use so-called environment and conflict alerts to because we have like longitude studies, which takes months and months to prepare, for example, a deforestation report. But sometimes we want to respond immediately to an issue. So in this case, we have two reports on, we looked at the wildfires in Syria, which were breaking out in 2019-2020, doing a burnt area analysis to see how much crops were affected. Some of them would be linked with shelling, like deliberate shelling of areas by different armed groups and regime forces, and the other one in Iraq was sort of similar, and also linked again with how droughts and armed conflict can have exacerbating effects because people start firing, like the conflict continues. So what we've came to show is that like those kind of approaches are very helpful to drive also the debate. So we can have a much more granular level detail to conflict-linked environmental damages, because we cannot enter the area. We can use the social media examples and or footage and satellite imagery to monitor what's happening, and also there are opportunities to collect data from the field itself through citizen science methods. We can combine that with like a lot of helpful data on the background, which is available in the background, or background data on specific areas. So what's the biodiversity of a certain area? What were pre-war conditions or issues? For example, in Syria, we looked at like a specific refinery on the coast, which has been leaking, but was also classified already as a major problem before the war. And then we can combine that and make different overviews on what's happening. So building layers of data, which is helpful to understand what situation was before the conflict, how the conflict has been worsening environmental damage, what kind of information is relevant immediately for humanitarian actors. So in case they need to know, am I going to set up an IDP camp or internally displaced person camp near to an area, near to a river? Is there upstream pollution from that river? So can we use the water or not, which was a case in Syria? And sharing that information is helpful for humanitarians. It's helpful for post-conflict reconstruction methods, because already we don't have to wait until the war has finished or the hostilities are over, but we can already have the data or a large chunk of the data available and already start raising, do fundraising and planning on how to look at, for example, priority sites that need rapid cleanup and what can be planned in the long term in terms of remediation and restoration of areas so people can safely return and rebuild their lives. So this wealth of data really provides a good insight. So what can we do? So we can identify the data. It's also important to develop these methods. So what we're trying to do is outline how we use the data, where you can find the data. So it's not us, like just a Western NGO who does that kind of work, but also to train our local partners on using these different data platforms so they can do it themselves. And sharing that information with the wider community. So it's already great to see that like other NGOs have now used the same methods and are inspired by that to use the same. And you saw in the previous presentation. So it's really good to see, and there are more organizations now doing it as well. So by putting it on the website, explaining how we do it, where you can find it, we hope to inspire others to use similar approaches. Here's one example where we actually work directly with UNOCHA on looking at explosive weapons impact in populated areas and environmental health risks. So in Mosul, which faced intense shelling during the siege and the fight against ISIS there, we can use that model. We can sort of look at what are the hazardous sites inside Mosul, what kind of chemicals are stored there, what could you come across in post-conflict situations, and what are like risk to water, sanitation, and infrastructure. How do you deal with debris in post-conflict situations? Could there be asbestos and other work? Here's another example where we also help media. So in this case, there was concerns over the impact of droughts during in 2021, and we looked at how this has been developed and changed throughout the years by looking at weather, meteorological data, and also using like the Earth observation data to look at specific locations where water has been retreating, and also trying to inform journalists on, okay, this is what the data tells about the historic trends and what's happening at the moment, and trying to quantify those kind of impact, which is helpful for storytelling. Also in Ukraine, we've been looking at specific sites. So we have 2 reports out looking at specifically at energy infrastructure and agro-industrial facilities. And there are a couple of reports coming looking at oil infrastructure that was damaged during the war, and one at the urban damage to areas similar to the one we did at Mosul, but then with the more recent data. And this is also very helpful to raise awareness among, to work with journalists, to explain like why the environment is an issue, and also to engage with policymakers, with politicians, and with international institutions to ensure that the environmental components are included in post-conflict reconstruction funding, in green rebuilding of Ukraine, and also for the Ukrainian government, so they have access to that information. And here's a couple of like ways just to visualize on how that works. So here on the left top corner, you see how using data from NASA, how you can see during the conflict, it will sort of have blacked out the country due to attacks on energy infrastructure. So power plants were bombed, but also Ukrainian government urged people to take out the lights at night just to prevent people or prevent Russia for using that as using lights to navigate. But you can easily visualize that with satellite data. And on the top right corner, you see an oil spill from near to an oil rig, which was targeted. An oil rig was occupied by Russia and which was bombed by Ukraine early in the conflict. And you see like the spill on the water, which using open source satellite imagery. On the bottom left side, there is something that's called the Weirs. It's the visible infrared imaging radiometer suite, which is also by NASA. It's a satellite that picks up heat signals, and yeah, you can clearly see the fighting going on the front line last year, with all the red dots going on. So all the burning forests, burning houses, burning vehicles, which are like, if the fire is large enough, like satellite would pick it up. And on the left, right corner, you see Maxar, which is a high resolution imagery provider, which also puts out often like really sharp resolution imagery of what's of the conflict. And here you see like a whole field peppered with crater impacts. So this is, for example, very helpful for understanding how much agricultural land has been affected. It's helpful for explosive ordnance and deminers to identify areas of concern. And it's also helpful to see how intense the shelling is in terms of potentially also environmental impacts, particularly from accumulation of heavy metals and other chemicals associated with munitions constituents which are not exploded that could leak into the soil and accumulate over time. So that's more like longer term studies. So what are like opportunities and limitations from open source information? So limitation is like, by doing this and publishing it, there's first of all, like limitation is practical, because always, in particular in Ukraine, but there's a lot of cloud cover and also more tropical areas, so you can't always see what's happening in real time or near real time. But often, like, we do have pretty good satellite image of what's happening. But there also is a risk of that being misused by governments or militaries or armed groups for doing battle damage assessments or for planning strikes. So there's always this trade-off. So as long as open source, everyone has access to it, but like with this kind of data, like high resolution imagery, and that's why, for example, Maxar stopped sharing access to Ukraine imagery because Russia was making use of it. There's a risk. The opportunities is that you can zoom in on really specific incidents, which is helpful for what I mentioned earlier, assessment, reconstruction, remediation, but also for accountability on documenting widespread to understand the quantity of the damage and potentially on any accountability mechanism post-conflict. It's also important to see how we can improve this data sharing. So particularly in Ukraine, there are so many organizations now doing this. There's a lot of overlap of work, which is really, in one side is really good. There's so much attention for it. The other side is a lot of redundancy. So how can we develop better tools and develop methods to share these kind of things, the kind of data? But there's of course a lot of sensitivities involved. So for example, I know the ICRC is doing its own industrial damage assessments in Ukraine. They have a whole database of it, but they don't share it publicly. But I also know other organizations, humanitarian organizations, doing the same thing as well. So there's a lot of money, I would say, going wasted and efforts going wasted because we're all doing the same thing, but we're not sharing it. So we also want to see how can we improve collaborative efforts to use this kind of work to awareness raising. Well, that's already mentioned before as well. It's really helpful to, we often talk to the media, we get questions like, why do you care as a peace organization about the environment in conflict? And then we can really outline, okay, there are direct health risk for humans from exposure to kind of chemicals or nasty materials, or in the long term, it affects their livelihoods and ecosystem, which is also really important, in particular also in facing climate crisis. And it's also, we want to do is like how we can develop a wider methodology that's because Ukraine gets a lot of attention, but we can also use all these lessons from Ukraine to have a method that everyone can use, and not just specialized organizations as ourselves and others, but it's like a widely accessible method where you have verification, and strengthen that and use this kind of work for improving assessments response to clean up the issues that I mentioned before. And also at the same time, we use all this information to engage with the UN and other data platforms to build awareness around the environment, peace, and security agenda, and strengthen accountability for military activities. Engage with the military on like what are the implications of your operations, what can you share yourself in terms of data. This is how we can help you understand that if you target for example, a power plant or an oil refinery, it has also widespread consequences. That helps sort of inform them, and it helps sort of educate the militaries on things that often they don't think about. So I think that's helpful. And also on a larger level, in the UN level, we can build strengthen sort of better policies that, for example, environment is included in international financial institutions like the World Bank or others, to have that included in their remediation work and post-conflict analysis, which is already happening in Ukraine. And we see that that's being driven by the data that now they're including that. So all of that is I think helpful for how data is really shaping the narrative, is shaping the discussion on improving protection of the environment in armed conflict, and is also supporting faster humanitarian response. You can find much more of this on our website, paxforpeace.nl. I'm using my Twitter account often to share these kind of things. And feel free, if you're interested, to drop me a line. We have much more reports and issues coming out. So thanks so much for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Wim, for that comprehensive introductory remarks, and I will leave it over to Marty.
Good evening. Thank you so much to the American Red Cross for this invitation, and also for the inclusivity of your panels. I am Marty Bradley from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. My areas of specialization are conflict classification and the law of non-international armed conflict. I also have a special interest in discussions surrounding the protection of the environment, as my own continent is so very much affected by NIACs, during NIAC, and the obligations, or rather lack of obligations, IHL places on non-state organized armed groups, or NZACs, to protect the environment. So most contemporary armed conflicts can be classified as NIACs. It is estimated by mid-2020, there were more than 50 NIACs in at least 22 countries. In 2021, the ICRC assessed that globally, around 600 armed groups were in a position to cause violence sufficient to be of humanitarian concern, and at least 100 of these qualify as NZACs, consequently are bound by the law of non-international armed conflict. So environmental damage is a serious corollary to the violence generated in a NIAC. To add to Wim's examples, in the Darfur region of Sudan, the militia group Janjaweed burnt fields and villages, contaminated water supplies that had a catastrophic effect on parts of the natural environment. Further examples are the purposeful attacking of farms in Yemen and the targeting by IS or ISIS of Yazidi farmers and the rural environment in Iraq. Common Article 3, which is binding on all parties to a NIAC, and Additional Protocol 2, binding on NZACs and dissident armed forces, which meet the criteria set out under Article 1.2 of AP2, regrettably offer no direct protection for the environment. There are scholars who argue certain prohibitions under Common Article 3 have an environmental dimension under the categories governing violence to life, cruel treatment and torture, outrages on personal dignity, and degrading treatment. Tara Smith observes, with regard to the suggestion that Common Article 3 indirectly prohibits environmental damage in NIAC, and I quote her observation, Common Article 3 is neither the strongest nor the most convincing provision in this regard. And as the audience will recall, CA3 is the only treaty provision that binds all NZACs. So as a positivist, I support her observation. And moreover, I have to highlight that unfortunately, even though additional Protocol 2 as well does not reiterate Article 35.3 of AP1, Article 35.3 of AP1, which prohibits causing serious damage to the natural environment. And you will know that Article 35.3 of AP1 is also phrased in a way that makes for a very high threshold to actually trigger this prohibition. So Rule 45, back to NIACs, of the customary IHL study of the ICRC, essentially reproduces Article 35.3 of AP1. But in its commentaries, the ICRC cautions against advancing a case that this rule applies in NIACs, and I absolutely agree. The commentary to Rule 45, however, states, even if this rule is not yet customary, it presents trends towards further protection of the environment and towards establishing rules applicable in NIACs, meaning that it is likely to become customary in due course. And we hope that the same will, of course, happen with PERAC. So absent from the Rome Statute, just to further flag the need for PERAC, absent from the Rome Statute is NIAC war crimes in relation to the environment, which suggests that at the time of its adoption, there was no corresponding IHL provision that has customary international law status. And indeed, it was hotly debated, if you look at the draft commentaries, whether or not this should be included, a war crime against the environment during NIAC. And the drafters agreed that there simply wasn't enough evidence that this is even a rule that is close to customary international law. So for these reasons, PERAC is a critical contribution. It remains important, however, that consideration is paid to the potential of codes of conduct. And here I refer to the inspiring work done by Geneva Call. My hope is that Geneva Call incorporate the protection of the environment as a future thematic and introduce a deed of commitment supporting a prohibition on a defined threshold of environmental devastation, which specifically addresses the protection of animals in conflict settings. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Marty. And as you can see in the chat, we're already running a little over, but we will provide the recording for anyone who can't stay for the whole while. And I asked my panelists to the extent that you are able to keep your answers brief so that we can also get to some questions from our audience before they have to hop off. But something that both of you and Doug also touched on in his presentation was non-state armed groups, right? And I think we covered pretty well how they have affected the environment negatively, or how they have targeted the environment. And that's also supported in a recent policy brief published by the Danish Institute for International Studies. Just wanted to give a quick shout out to one of the authors, Haro Munive, who was also supposed to be on this panel, but had to go for field work, and I hope that we can drop that link to that work in the chat as well. His work finds that it's mostly a negative impact or a mixed impact on the environment from non-state armed groups. But what I wanted to ask you, and I'll go to Marty first, and then you'll see if you have anything to add to that, Vim, is whether there are examples of non-state armed groups that attempt to protect the natural environment for different reasons, or what the issues are in engaging with these groups on environmental protection. So I'll leave it to Marty first.
So on a positive note, there are NZACs who aspire to protect the environment. Several NZACs provide for protection of the environment in their codes of conduct. Of course, this does not have any status under Article 38(1) of the ICJ statute, but they do tend to adhere, and at least this promotes buy-in. So their adherence or their protection of the environment and aspirations vary in respects of aspects of environmental protection, as well as regional differences in the various NIACs. So a few NZACs who aspire to protect the environment include the Kurdish Workers' Party, the former Sudanese People's Liberation Movement, the Chin National Front, the Lord's Resistance Army, the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, the National Liberation Movement of La Azawad, and the Ogaden National Liberation Front. So protecting the environment in armed conflict and in assessing the IHL framework, it's a very broad legal obligation for these NZACs. In addition to protecting the environment, it consists of layers of considerations such as direct impacts caused by the conduct of hostilities, indirect impact as a result of the armed conflict, damage caused by humanitarian assistance, and long-term considerations, which include the protection of the environment after an armed conflict. And the next panel will speak to that. And this lasts for many years. So in my view, the core issue, to answer the second part of the question, is that as IHL treaty law is absolutely silent, in my view, on the protection of the environment in NIACs, and as it is very controversial whether NZACs are bound by either international environmental law or IHRL, I believe they're not. Codes of conduct and deeds of commitment are legal tools for improving compliance with these armed groups. And I can perhaps just offer an example. I know that we are quite short of time, but even though Geneva Call does not have a specific thematic on the protection of the environment, I really hope that this will change in the future. They do, in the deed of commitment for the prevention of starvation and addressing conflict-related food insecurity, in code number 3 offers indirect protection, which says that armed groups or NZACs are to protect objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as foodstuff, agricultural areas for the protection of foodstuffs, crops, livestock, and so forth. And if I could mention a very interesting study by the ICRC, it's called the African Value Study. And what they do to further engage with armed groups is that they actually looked at values that is inherent in certain of the African tribes. And then when they engage those communities, they come not from the Western IHL perspective, but from look at this value. And this IHL principle also addresses the environment. So it's part of your values and your community values to actually protect the environment. Of course, this is indirectly through things like military necessity and so forth. But if you look at the Islamic study, and I'm not an expert on this, that the ICRC has done also to engage non-state armed groups, you will see that there are indeed values that are directed at the protection of the environment. So I think this is something that we can explore more, at least to get buy-in.
Yeah, from the legal side, I'll leave it over to the legal experts. I can just tell from our own experience in Northeast Syria, where the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are mainly led by the YPG, it's the People Protection Units, which is also linked with the PKK, the Turkish-based Kurdistan Workers' Party. They do have ecology a lot in their ideology, and it's stated they're driven by the basic democratic model based on an American anarcho-ecologist. But I must say, in practice, it's basically it's a state that's run on oil, and the pollution there is severe. There's hardly any issues. They're not really addressing all these issues. It's both by conditions outside of their control, but there's always the theory and there's a praxis. So and the practice here is that, like, there are serious environmental issues, which is not a priority for them, and because they're in survival mode, but the situation itself proves a lot of corruption. So there's always, people don't always believe people blindly on what they say, but rather look at, particularly with armed groups, on what they do. That's our experience. So there are some initiatives which are by, among other Geneva-based organizations, to engage with non-state armed groups to discuss about committing to certain principles, which I think is fruitful and helpful. And I might be wrong here. I think it was Geneva Call, but others as well, to engage with those kind of groups to see what can be done. But yeah, it always remains difficult because of accountability issues and lack of mechanisms to actually deal with that, and also their nature of these kind of groups, that they're often not controlling certain areas, and if they do, they are at disadvantage, so they have other concerns to think about than protecting the environment. So that's sort of just our own experience in working in Syria and Iraq with that.
Thank you. I think that really complemented each other well, sort of thinking about it from the legal perspective and the initiatives, and also your experience on the ground, Wim. And I really want to get back to some of that experience that you have, Wim, and especially the point that you had about how data is key to show the complexities of the environmental impact. I just want to explore really briefly, because I also have a fun question from the audience that I want to pose before we go over to the next panel. But this is a question sort of, if you could elaborate a little bit on how environmental data can be used to inform commanders' decisions as to environmental consequences, or on the flip side, how their sharing of information can help aid the remediation process afterwards. Could you just speak briefly to that?
Yeah, so in terms of informing commanders, like we hope with particularly with the work we've done, and we also provide input to the ICRC's updated military guidelines on protection of the environment, on conflict, that sort of having this understanding this complexity of what the longer term impacts are of damage would inform commanders to think a bit better about the decisions they make on what kind of targets they strike in conflict. So for example, you saw in Syria that instead of targeting the refineries directly, the US targeted empty oil tankers which were exporting the crude oil from the refineries to areas where oil salesmen would sell it. So to limit the environmental damage, they made that particular decision not to strike the refineries directly and limit the environmental damage. I think that's a good practice. And also there were cases where they did well, it was good looking, for example, Russia did target the refineries directly, where the US was a bit more reluctant and restrained themselves in terms of with environmental considerations in mind. The other way around is that I think sharing data on what kind of locations you have attacked. So in particular, the example I gave from depleted uranium, this is crucial because having particular even if it's low radioactive, but if you have like radioactive waste in conflict affected areas where authorities often don't have capacity to deal with that, you have deminers in the field who are doing mine clearance. They need to have the information, what kind of munitions do I run into, what kind of extra protection measures should I take for my own staff, what kind of extra protection measures should we take for the communities where it's been used. So having the data will improve like rapid cleanup. It will minimize risk to civilians. So that's one thing. And the second thing is I also learned that like militaries usually build really strong assessments, general environmental assessments of the area they operate in, outlining all the risks, for example. So I got the military intelligence report from the Dutch government on Iraq, which I think like that kind of data, having this really thick report is helpful for humanitarians. Also going into it's not like national security sensitive data, but it's really good to have to share some vital elements for other organizations or NGOs operating areas, so they know what they come across, or for international organizations that they know what they should invest in terms of remediation or reparation efforts. So I think that's the other way around, where the militaries can play a role in sharing that kind of data, of course, with the limitations if it's not super sensitive. But I think there's a much more to be gained from that.
Thank you. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of opportunities for development here, and I'm glad to hear it, and thank you for sharing that. One quick question that I had from our audience that's a little on the side of what we've been talking about here, but that I know that Marty has some insight into is the protection of animals in armed conflict. And it's been argued that they should have enhanced protection from what they have today recently in some scholarly works. And so I wondered if you, Marty, could just briefly help us out with explaining what the protections are and sort of what the development is on that front.
Thank you so much. So I have to give a shout out to my doctoral student, Ms. Queen Virtue. I was convinced before meeting her that the current protection of including animals in the broader concept of the environment is enough, but she has adequately convinced me that animals need explicit protection, and I will explain why. So animals suffer from being in the firing line of armed conflict. Research indicates that approximately 80% of contemporary armed conflicts take place in biodiversity hotspots. This is very worrying. Horrific examples of such negative effects on animals is bombs strapped to donkeys and horses by the Revolutionary Armed Forces in conducting attacks, targeting convoys during the war in Iraq. Donkeys were used to pull carts of explosives and bombs, were strapped to dogs. In Mozambique, it is reported that approximately 100 elephants have been killed by landmines. And during the Afghan war in the 1990s, more than 75,000 animals were killed by mines. So I want to turn to the current protection of animals during armed conflict. IHL in its essence is anthropocenic. There is a lacuna concerning the direct protection, and that is the emphasis, the direct protection to the environment during armed conflict, and specifically NIACs. And there's an even larger gap in the law that relates to the protection of animals during armed conflict, if it's IACs or NIACs. So De Hemtzien labels this as the silence of IHL and maintains that IHL essentially ignores the issue of protecting animals. It's all too easy to imagine that the drafters of the Hague regulations in the Geneva Conventions, remember now this was 1949, saw no need to address the issue. Certain scholars argue that IHL affords indirect protection to animals, referencing the protection provided to objects indispensable for the survival of the civilian population, to the environment, to cultural property, as well as to medical transports and equipment. And they do a very advanced, I guess, Article 31, 33 BCLT interpretation using the Vienna Convention as an interpretive tool for progressive interpretation, but that is not enough. So Peters, who's one of the leading scholars on the topic, Anna Peters, states that animals do not easily fit in this category of objects, as the purpose of this is indeed to protect inanimate objects. And Rossini restricts the reference as being limited also to inanimate objects, which begs the question how animals can be protected as objects. And this argument is, or it's rejected by Papaya, that animals should ever be included in the meaning of objects, because essentially in military or civilian use, animals are animates and they are sentient beings. So Peters and De Hemtzien propose a broader understanding be adopted via an open IHL concept of object to provide greater protection of animals during armed conflicts. Of course, there are unfortunately no rules that explicitly protect animals, but as Rossini states, we need to protect animals, or those rules that might seem specific, but they're not only because they're essential to human beings, and not because of a recognition of their fundamental values. So most rules would refer to animals as having some economic value to humans before they would consider having protection. So where are we now? That is the question. Where are we now? So of late, there is an awareness of the need to improve conditions of animals in armed conflict. Professor Rosny's article, and this was really a big moment for animal law, and was the spark that lit the flame. So he undertook an in-depth analysis of IHL and its application to animals, and argued that there was a serious gap in the literature, as no article of international law or monograph dealt with the topic. And this is 2017. This is only 5 years ago. So Anna Peters and Jerome de Hemtzien contributed to the amendment of this fault by their publication of Studies in Global Animal Law. And then the latest contribution, which is very thought-provoking, Animals in the International Armed Conflict by Anna Peters, Jerome de Hemtzien, and Robert Kolb, was published last year. And this really breaks the shackles of this Anthropocenic view. And the authors really try, and the contributors, to see how we can use the first principles of IHL to offer at least some protection. But again, there is a call for more. And it's not enough to adopt an evolutionary interpretation approach, because that will not probably fly in front of the ICJ and so forth. So I hope that there could perhaps be some intervention through Geneva Call or a document similar to PERAC, but I think with the current situation in Ukraine, unfortunately, animals might again be overlooked. So thank you.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you to both of you for really trying to condense extensive subject matter into this short panel. I'll just quickly hand it over to the next panel so that we can get in another batch of extensive subject matter into a panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Taya, and thanks to our panelists so far. This has been a fantastic event. I want to hand the baton over to our next moderator, a legal professional, an attorney I've had the privilege to work alongside for the last year. She's Carolina Selnick. She's our current Clara Barton IHL Fellow, and she's going to introduce our next panel on peace process and accountability. Thanks, Carolina.
Thank you, Thomas. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. As Thomas said, welcome to the Peace Processes and Accountability section of this webinar. Here with us today are Dr. Tegan Blaine from USIP, Maud Sarleaf from the University of Strathclyde, and Dr. Wendy Goldsmith from DoD, NATO, and the Center for Global Resilience. If we could have our panelists please introduce yourselves in that order and deliver remarks. Thank you.
So shall I start? Sorry, I was... Hi, so my name is Maud Sarleaf. I'm actually a practitioner rather than a university professor. My association with Strathclyde University was from some time ago and I'm still associated with them as a French reporter for the climate litigation situation in France. But my primary area of expertise is actually international criminal law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and I've also touched upon terrorism and organized crimes. That's where I started. I practiced initially, or like the first time I started with this area of law was in Cambodia, where I worked with investigating judges on the investigations of the Khmer Rouge crimes, and then I moved to Kosovo, where I was working with prosecutors on organized crime, terrorism, war crimes, and the likes. And then to The Hague, where I worked closely with I was basically leading the defense team on a case that you might have heard of, which involved a terrorist attack against Rafah in 2005. And I also worked in Rwanda, etc., etc. And after a few years of those practices with judges, defense lawyers, prosecutors on international criminal law, I somehow felt a little disheartened because of the slow pace, etc. And I also could see that the environment was definitely not a priority concern, and the climate was not a priority concern, which is one of the reasons why I decided to take some steps back and live without pay and leave tribunals and institutions for a little while, not too long, to conduct my own investigation and my own research, which eventually led me to South America, where I traveled in Colombia, Ecuador, and Brazil between 2018 and 2019, which was a very interesting time to travel in these areas, particularly after Bolsonaro was elected. And tested all the ideas and expertise that I had in ICL, so international criminal law, international humanitarian law, human rights law, to see how this legal and procedural framework, particularly the legal framework, could be adapted to the environmental and climate crisis. And so two basic avenues that I looked into. The first one was to change the law. So, looking into amending the Rome Statute, for example, to add ecocide as a fifth crime. But first and foremost, before launching this kind of initiative, which because of diplomatic, political, and many other reasons usually take a long while, the first step was to try and push for a creative interpretation of the provisions that were already there, so the Rome Statute provision, which is why I filed one of the communications being submissions before the Prosecution's Office of the International Criminal Court, calling for mass deforestation to be considered as a crime against humanity, persecution and other inhuman acts. And that was, well, the submissions that I filed with All Rise, which was the NGO supporting the initiative, was in October 2021, but that's part of like a larger number of similar submissions filed by indigenous communities, Brazilian human rights collectives, etc. But that was in times of peace, obviously, although arguably, given the impact it has on those depending or defending the environment, some areas you could consider it as a non-international armed conflict. And in parallel also, I published a few articles, including one on the situation in Casamance between the Gambia and Senegal, where again, the trafficking of rosewood, I looked into the trafficking of rosewood and analyzed with another friend and colleague whether it could be considered as a war crime of pillage and destruction of property. And the last tests, or the last tests that I conducted was in 5 different Central African countries, where it was more connected to testing how domestic law could be used to fight against all the trafficking that was going on in Chad, Centrafrique, the Congo-Brazzaville, Cameroon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was really interesting to get the insight of my African colleagues working for prosecutors, custom officers, judges, or literally the rangers, like the ones in the field, telling openly to each other, to one another, in working groups, what was not working, basically. So it was a different perspective, but that's where I came from. And currently, and well, basically the conclusion was like, yes, well, there's a lot to be done. And the work that Doug and Wim are doing is incredibly useful to collect data, to raise awareness, to do advocacy. And I had the privilege to sort of interact with them as part of the work that I'm doing now, which is advising the Prosecutor General of Ukraine in the investigation and prosecution of war crimes impacting the environment. And as some of you may know, the Ukrainian Criminal Code also incriminates ecocide. It's one of the very few countries which has included a definition of ecocide in their codes. I'm not sure that it's always that huge a step forward, but it's interesting and useful to know it. So that's it in a nutshell. That's given me like a few unique insights into the legal challenges from a practitioner's point of view, which are fed by all the discussions and incredibly interesting theoretical work that's conducted by the like of Stavros and Maria and Martha, who spoke just before in the previous panel. And I'm hoping also to use that to continue working towards an adaptation of the legal framework for better protection of the environment and the climate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maud. And maybe we could hear from Dr. Blaine now.
Hello, everybody. It's great to have an opportunity to get to know everybody on this panel and to have hopefully an engagement with the listeners and the people participating in this discussion today. My name is Tegan Blaine. I am at the U.S. Institute of Peace as the director of the program on climate, environment, and conflict. You know, perhaps I come at this field very differently than many of the speakers here. USIP is a weird institution that does quite a bit of applied research and think tanky work and policy work. But then we also have a whole set of offices on the ground that are dealing with working on conflict from over an entire range of conflicts, from very community-oriented conflicts and helping communities learn to address their own conflicts, all the way up to supporting major negotiations. About 5 years ago, the U.S. Institute of Peace began to wrestle with where environment fit into its peacebuilding work. It had kind of dealt with these issues on a one-off basis, but not very consistently. And so over the last few years, we have both begun putting money into some work that helps us better understand how the environmental peacebuilding field is developing and how we can support that, but also beginning to work on our own policy work in terms of prevention and beginning to support some of our field offices in integrating environmental issues into the work that they do on the ground. If anybody's interested, I can talk a little bit about some of our policy-related work and prevention work. But I think for this group, you might be a little bit more interested in where we're thinking about our role vis-a-vis the environmental peacebuilding community. Environmental peacebuilding is not a very old field. It really only became a term about 20 years ago, and the environmental peacebuilding field is often driven by people like me who originally come from more of a scientific or environmental background and then are getting into peacebuilding because they're beginning to see how conflicts develop over natural resources or how natural resources are abused during conflict, in conflict zones and things like that. So many of the people who still consider themselves environmental peace builders often came from an environmental background originally, and then started moving into the peace building world. Environmental peace building as a field is still quite disjointed. There's quite a lot of experience of people working on integrating environment issues into peace-building processes or beginning to address some of the impacts of war, like a lot of the discussion today. But there have been very few efforts to actually begin consolidating our understanding of what approaches in the environmental peace-building field work, what actually get us furthest, what approaches are less effective in terms of how we bring environment into peace-building work. One of the things that the USIP has done in the last few years is start investing in a series of case studies and learnings around the environmental peace-building world. And some of the work much of this was started during the pandemic, and so some of it was delayed, but we are beginning to wrap up many of those case studies and learnings right now. Some of what may be interesting to this community is that we have been looking basically at consolidating the environmental peace building experience into how we think about different theories of change, how we think about different approaches to environmental peace building, and understanding what approaches work and which are less effective. And so that is part of the efforts that we have been investing in over the last few years, beginning to take specific sectors. So in this case, we prioritize the water sector, and we are working with partners who have a lot of experience working on environmental peace building vis-a-vis water to begin thinking about how we identify different approaches to environmental peace building in the water sector and how we begin to categorize those so that we can better understand which approaches are working and which are not. In addition, we have been working with another partner on the first attempt to systematize, I'm stumbling over my words today, systematize monitoring and evaluation in this area. And so hopefully this toolkit will help us better understand how we can monitor our different approaches and understand what's working and improve our reporting and decision-making around many of these approaches as well. This field is absolutely critical in my mind. You know, the United Nations Environment Program has done some background work that shows over the last 60 years, 40% of civil wars have been associated with natural resources. And half of all peace agreements over the period between 1989 and 2004 contained provisions around natural resources. In more recent years, a far larger percentage have dealt with natural resources. However, some of the work that we have done has found that conflicts associated with natural resources, where those are worked into the peace agreement, actually show a greater risk of relapse over the next 5 years than peace agreements that don't. However, I think that this issue of how environment fits into peace agreements is going to be absolutely critical moving forward, especially as we begin to understand the impacts of climate change and how that is driving resources around or driving conflicts around natural resources, but also how we think about integrating the use of natural resources as a common ground around which to bring people together and look at ways of building trust and cooperation on which additional trust and cooperation can be built, because natural resources are often so critical to people's survival. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Wendy, but I look forward to the conversation later.
Thank you. I have a couple slides to speak to, in part because I'm going to take us into the zone of war in the Ukraine, where I haven't been directly involved, but I've worked in collaboration with Dr. Linkoff for over 20 years, and I began collaborations with Dr. Chimaris shortly before the war broke out. And I'm here to pass along some of the presentation that they developed and presented earlier this year. Next slide, please. So in short, the environment in Ukraine has undergone many of the same changes, with a few exceptions, of some of the rest of the portions of Central Europe. And one of the important baseline data studies for Ukraine centered around the Chernobyl disaster, where a huge international effort actually established a tremendous amount of baseline information, and also spearheaded a series of investments in waste management, water management, and addressing air quality and so on. The war in Ukraine has obviously focused around the front of the border between Russia and Ukraine, and to the south from Crimea into the main body of Ukraine. And these overlap with a bunch of the areas where the endemic wild horse, ancestral horse populations, and the Black Sea dolphin are existing. And there have been a number of impacts to all of these species that are of interest in Ukraine. You can go to the next slide. And the next slide. So overall, about 30% of the protected areas in Ukraine have actually been affected by military maneuvers. Doug showed the fires and the industrial ravages that have occurred. And Wim also mentioned things like the use of depleted uranium weapons. And although the Russians have kind of spun that up as if it's a nuclear attack, it's not nearly like that. It's just a very heavy metal that is very destructive. And, you know, all in all, there's a tremendous amount of soil and water contamination, not just in discrete battlefields, but essentially throughout the nation. And this plus sea mines have caused damage to many animals, with a large number of these unique dolphins having been documented as dying, and extensive wildfires causing nearly 1 million acres of nearly 1 million hectares of damage to this point in time. Next slide. So really, in looking at how to recover these environmental damages in Ukraine, it's important to look, as this graph shows, there might be some ideal natural, non-industrial, and agriculturally impacted natural conditions in that dashed line at the top, and some baseline resource conditions, similar to what Ukraine, in fact, had previously documented. And what we're looking at is a case where a tremendous amount of at least short-term damage occurs, and in the process of making restitution to provide a remedy for these impacts, we need to not just allow for natural recovery and ecological succession, but to actually bring things back to a level that is higher than the baseline, that can be serving a compensatory function to make up for the lost, degraded time period that we're in the midst of, and we can only hope will be kept as short as possible. But in order to do this, it's going to require a tremendous amount of coordination to establish the important coherence of approaches so that there can be agreement on the impacts and the strategy forward. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you so much to our panelists. We've heard from Maud on the overlap in international criminal law and environmental protection. We've heard from Tegan about the environmental peace building space. And now we've heard from Dr. Wendy Goldsmith on the resource recovery strategies and needed remedies. We will transition now to a few questions to our panelists. And as an audience, please feel free to direct your questions into our chat. So just to open this up to our group, as we've discussed, environmental issues can both pose as a conflict driver as well as an opportunity for cooperation. Can you elaborate on this duality and how states or mediating bodies should strike that balance between increasing protection of the environment and other resource demands in a post-conflict reconstruction process?
I'm happy to take this on, but I'm happy to leave the floor to others if you prefer.
I think we should start with you, Dr. Blaine, and then maybe we can open that up or direct it to another panelist, if that's okay with you.
Okay, sounds great. You know, this is a really challenging question, I think, especially because people are still sorting their way through this field, and a lot of people have very individual experiences, but we still have yet to fully think through these issues based on experience. One of the things that I think about a lot, and especially because I work more on climate change than I do on natural resources, is how environmental issues, and specifically climate change, might result in drivers of conflict. But I do think that there's a really important role as well for cooperation around these issues. One of the pieces of information that really changed how I thought about these issues was the statistic that 50 to 80% of ex-combatants return to agriculture. And that really brings home to me how important local environments are in just helping reintegrate combatants into society, giving them pathways to think about how they support their families, integrating them into a community of other people, some of whom may have been combatants and some of may have whom or may not have been. And it seems to me as though, well, I think that there's a lot to be said for ensuring that there are discussions in the peace building process about what it means for natural resources as these people come home, what it means for managing some of the environmental degradation and access to natural resources for communities who are there. And this can really be a unifying source of a reason for a community to work together, because everybody has a vested interest in it. There's nobody who doesn't need food security. There is nobody who doesn't need water security. There is nobody who doesn't need a way to ensure that they can be comfortable providing for their families. And so from that perspective, it can be quite unifying. But I think we also need to recognize how much competition over natural resources can drive conflict. And that may also bring in incredibly sensitive issues here. And so one thing that I have heard from many peace builders is that as peace builders who are trying to encourage kind of the peace agreements to help stabilize an area, that it's really important to be driven by what people feel comfortable talking about and where their interests are. If you think that environmental issues is a driver of the conflict and needs to be better explored, it's okay to bring that up. But if communities aren't ready to address that, then it's really necessary to respect that and to move on to other areas where people are ready to collaborate, are ready to communicate about particular issues. And this perhaps comes up in questions about climate change more than about natural resources. Climate change is likely driving conflict in complex ways that we don't fully understand, in how it's shifting natural resources and so on. But climate change is a very difficult topic to address. It requires a lot of long-term thinking about how a community will deal with climate change over the long run. And that's a place where we might see the impacts of climate change driving aspects of a conflict, but where a community might really just need to focus on the reestablishment of water points, for example, that people can really agree on. And some of these broader drivers might need to be pushed down the line a little bit until communities are ready to address such things. And so I do think that that aspect of really listening to the interlocutors in this space and understanding what they are comfortable addressing is one of the most important lessons that I have heard from a variety of people working in this field. But I'd be very curious what other people would contribute to this.
Well, if I may, I really like the approach that you've taken, Professor Blaine or Dr. Blaine. I don't know how I should be referring to you. And I agree that it's really important to listen and to take this very constructive and optimistic approach when part of the peace building process. I believe this is what the HEP, the Justice for Peace jurisdiction in Colombia is trying to do at the moment. They've recently delivered the fifth indictment, which attempts to actually consider territories as victims of the conflict. I think I have a note here where it's not exactly clear, but they insisted that transitional justice is also environmental justice, and deemed that some of the judges deemed that ecosystem damage is a war crime, so it's still to be adjudicated and discussed, etc. But indeed, in a country like Colombia, there is room for these discussions, and people are ready to do it. But at the same time, if you look at Darfur, for example, water was used as a weapon of war, where the wells were being poisoned, and that was the object of one of the allegations of genocide, as described in the warrant of arrest against al-Bashir back in 2010. In Armenia, at the moment, or Armenia, Azerbaijan, because of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, you also have issues regarding, the ore that's being mined, the land that's being farmed. And I think a few months ago, Azerbaijan filed or submitted, just asked for the creation of a tribunal arbitral, so arbitration, where they created a specific jurisdiction under the auspices of the Berne Convention, which arguably, according to some Armenians, is manipulated. Like the idea is to the idea of the Azeris is like, we're going to use the Berne Convention to argue that the Armenians are destroying the ecosystems and biodiversity, etc. But then the Armenians are saying, well, this is a tool to manipulate our side against theirs. So that's where you can tell that's absolutely no room for discussion, and the drivers of the conflict are also the ones preventing the peace process from happening at this point in time, unfortunately. And in Ukraine, it's another issue. I don't think peace process is for tomorrow, but that's from my perspective. I have other examples with the RC that we could talk about as well. But yeah, it's sort of a two-edged sword. And like you said, it's all about the timing and listening to the parties.
I'd love to say a few words. I think that climate change is a lever that is affecting everything else. And beginning 20 years ago, the US Department of Defense referred to climate change as a threat multiplier, basically speaking about how it is a catalyst to unrest. It's been documented, and the shortages of water and land resources and food resources have catalyzed a lot of things over history, and especially in recent history. And the Department of Defense sees climate change shifting the trends going forward. I've been involved in a bunch of, as an expert witness, in a bunch of climate change related lawsuits in the US, not tied to natural resources per se, really affecting the wider issue of how some critical infrastructure facilities have not been built and maintained to be adequately durable in the face of the type of storm impacts due to climate change. And I'm really intrigued by how some of those frameworks for viewing the climate change impacts can be brought into the wartime restitution realm as well. I think it'll be tricky to thread that needle, but a very important needle to thread.
Dr. Goldsmith, I think that's an excellent point and a great segue to the next question, which could tie very well into Maud's work in criminal law, as well as to the data collection efforts of other panels that we've mentioned. So to our panelists, what is the crossover, if any, between evidence collection for the purposes of criminal trials and data collection for civil, environmental, and climate litigation and environmental impact assessments?
Is that one for me? Well, I think there are overlaps, obviously, but the whole environmental impact assessment of a conflict goes far beyond what is needed and used in the context of a criminal investigation. But you know, and a criminal prosecution and a trial eventually, if it happens. But first of all, this is, I think everybody will agree and has said that this is very early days and very uncharted and explored territories. To my knowledge, very little, if any, case law has been deciding and ruling on these issues at the international level. At least there have been some commissions, such as the Iraqi commissions, but that's an exception, the exception rather than the rule, and not necessarily for the purpose of criminal trials. But when it comes to conducting or collecting evidence for the purpose of a criminal investigation and prosecution, this is, you know, very specific, because you have to establish that the elements of a specific crime or specific crimes are gathered. But it's the first step to identify the extent of what's been destroyed, degraded, of the environmental impact of the conflict. And also, particularly in Ukraine, for example, where the conflict is ongoing, when you can't access occupied territories or territories which, like Bakhmut, has been completely destroyed and are still very dangerous, or mined areas, etc., etc. Just drawing your attention to that and trying to figure out what's been happening, what's the extent of the damage, and how to assess it as part of the criminal investigation is the first step towards a larger assessment of the environmental impact as a whole. But like Wim was saying, at this point in time in countries like Ukraine, you have many different stakeholders conducting many different assessments, a little bit of coordinating challenge. And then conversely, in areas like Syria or Yemen, nothing's really being done nothing except for, the fantastic efforts of NGOs like PAX, CEOPS, ZOI, and others. That nothing is really being done with a view to investigate, with a view to prosecute. But still, back to the starting point and your question, the fact that it is getting a lot of attention in Ukraine, the fact that it has been considered and is being considered as a priority for the prosecutors of Ukraine is, I think, really encouraging as, a step forward in the direction of further investigations, further prosecutions beyond that particular conflict. But to answer your question specifically, first, that collecting evidence for the purpose of a criminal trial is also a first step towards a larger assessment on the environmental impact of the conflict.
Thank you, Maud. And so, unfortunately, we are running a little bit over, so I'll ask one final question, and then hopefully our audience can direct the rest of their questions to the chat or over email for a continued discussion. So in a post-conflict situation, there's typically a desire both for individual accountability or criminal responsibility, as well as peace and reconciliation. Can you speak to the trade-offs between these approaches in the context of environmental harm and protection and remediation, and how they might inform one another? Just to give a little bit of direction, I think that Dr. Belain and Maud would enjoy that question.
Well, I can try to provide some sort of answer, but yeah, I'm not sure it should be traded off. The environmental impact, but in terms of also people, one has to be realistic. But the point that I would like to make, it also echoes back to what Tegan Blaine was saying, again, messing with your title, sorry about that, but that everyone should have the right to a healthy environment, to clean water, to breathable air, to edible food. And this can't happen with farmland that's been heavily mined, with industrial plants which have been shelled and targeted, with crude oil pollution, etc., etc. So to tie everything also back to what I was saying before, the fact that in the investigations or the assessments are going to conduct to establish the risks is incredibly important. And if there's a trade-off to be made, it's to demand for reparations from whoever is held responsible for these damages. So at the end of the day, that's to me is the one acceptable trade-off. If you can't go for like a criminal trial, or if you can't set up some sort of ad hoc jurisdiction, which is going to cost billions anyway, and if I don't want to be politically correct, I could say put a lot of money in the pockets of very fancy international lawyers who don't need it, then use that money to provide reparations and to reestablish and restore the environment to what it was before as best as possible, and provide clean water, breathable air, and edible food, or access to farmland, access to decontaminated water to the populations, the peoples who need it and depend on it to survive. That's the acceptable trade-off I can imagine, I can think of at this point in time.
I'm not sure that I have a good answer to the question that you just asked, but one thing that I was thinking about when Maud was speaking earlier, and which is coming back up for me, is who has access to information and how does that information get used in peace processes? You know, for example, it's possible that communities don't necessarily understand how much a water source has been polluted by the conflict. And that may have long-term health ramifications that they don't necessarily know about early on, whereas the other side might have better information about what kinds of pollutants have been dumped in a water source and may impact people down the line. And so the kinds of inequities that arise in having these kinds of conversations or in how people use information as a source of power in these negotiations, when the information that both sides have may be very, very different, is something that probably deserves a lot more attention than it's been given so far. And I just wanted, may not be a good answer to the question that you were currently asking, Caroline, but I did want to bring it up as something that probably stands to get a lot more attention and thought about, is who has information and what power that accords them, especially around environmental issues, especially when you're trying to develop peace agreements after the fact.
I think that makes a lot of sense, actually. I think that information asymmetry is really interesting. I would like to wrap up by giving Dr. Goldsmith the last word. Dr. Goldsmith, if you have any answers to our questions previously asked, or if you'd like to speak to any transferable insights from peacetime environmental cleanup in relation to military activities to post-conflict environmental remediation. And I think we'll end it after that. Thank you.
I'd like to summarize a little bit to add to what Maud and Tegan have just said. I think I've seen and have read that others find this to be true too, that when there are deep-seated antagonisms and conflicts, often getting people together, drawing people together to solve a mutually beneficial environmental challenge can be a common ground that is hard to find in other domains. So I think that there's a need and an opportunity for that to be a somewhat hopeful avenue for that. That doesn't mean that both sides of the conflict are going to come together, but maybe the different factions on one side can actually overcome their conflicts and disagreements to agree on this large scale benefit of ecological repair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldsmith. And unless we have any other concluding thoughts from our panelists, I would like to thank each of our panelists for making the time to share your expertise with us today. And thank you to our audience for joining us from across the world. Thank you to Taya Anderson and the Red Cross. And I'd like to hand it over now to Thomas to conclude our presentation.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks to all of our panelists. This has been one of the most impactful. We're almost at 2 hours now. I feel like we could go all day and it would not seem like it. And just the profound relevancy of these issues and the insight that all of you as practitioners and experts in this field has been very fascinating. So I will be happy to speak for the entire audience and our entire team here at the Red Cross that I think we all share in that sentiment. I'm going to ask Taya to give just some concluding remarks here before I take us out with a little bit of an opportunity for you to learn more about our program and our offerings. I want to congratulate Taya. This whole event, both the first and the second part, and the future of this new series is her brainchild, her outstanding leadership and her vision for what she wanted this event to be. Took it from concept to reality, and in doing so, really etched a great next page in our excellent dissemination efforts. And this fits with the very best that we've been able to offer the public in terms of programming. So thank you, Taya. Take it away. Thanks.
Well, thank you for those very big words, Thomas. I want to take the opportunity to thank the last panel, especially because I wasn't able to be there for that conversation, but I think it's always such a fascinating conversation when you have different expertise come into the same room. Here we have a scientist, a lawyer, and a policy influencer, a policy person, coming together and sort of trying to stretch their brains into fields that aren't theirs and trying to see where the cross sections are. And I just think I love where the conversation went, and it's just so fascinating to see what we can do when we have these conversations. I'm really excited for the series. The series will continue. In between this and our next events, I will be sending out newsletters with links to these recordings, slides that were shared by some of our presenters, and other sort of relevant news and insights into this field. And we will start sending out to whoever participated in the event, and then we'll sort of build it from there. If there's anything you would like to hear more on or interested in us elaborating on, please let us know. In the fall, we will do a bigger event, hopefully around implementation, now that we have dived into the legal frameworks, the issues, the best practices. I would really love to see us dive into how we implement these lessons into domestic policy, into militaries, into other spaces where we think this would be relevant. So hopefully you'll follow us into the fall. And then I will let Thomas share all the links that he has now prepared while I've been speaking for further information.
There we go. The mute button just disappears on me. It's like Zoom is setting me up for failure here. So thank you again to everyone. I offer that really sincerely. The ability to bring together the absolute brain power, firepower that was assembled today in these last 2 hours is not an everyday opportunity, especially if you're in places across the United States or across the globe where you don't necessarily get to connect with people like this in person. So I want to thank all of you for your expertise and talent here today. Thank every one of our attendees. If you're viewing this later on YouTube, as both parts 1 and part 2 today will be posted onto YouTube in the coming days. Thank you for taking time to watch this. You can use the 2 QR codes. You can scan them with your cell phone camera. I wouldn't advise doing it like with a point and shoot. I don't know how that would probably break one of those cameras if those things still exist and are used. The QR code on the left will allow you to input your name and your email address. We'll get you signed up for our monthly event newsletter. You can find out about ongoing and upcoming NHQ, so National Headquarters level American Red Cross IHL events. We offer programming every single month. Next month in June of 2023, we're going to see a variety of content, including an anniversary event on the Yugoslavia tribunals, the ICTY, and we'll also have a pop culture event toward the end of the month on IHL issues in the Indiana Jones franchise. We'll sort of set Crystal Skull aside, but you can also learn more about volunteer opportunities. We are a volunteer-led organization. The IHL program is no different than the rest of the Red Cross in that regard, and more than 90% of our dissemination efforts are taken care of and done on the ground level by volunteers, and volunteers not just with legal expertise or experience, but people who are unified in their passion for IHL and for the humanity that it injects into something as inhumane as warfare. So use that QR code on the left for that. The QR code on the right will take you to our American Red Cross National Headquarters IHL YouTube channel. That is an absolute mouthful. That's our repository for all of our recordings. They're organized by playlist. These 2 parts will be put into our IHL, our broad brush IHL playlist. We'll also build a separate playlist because this is a new series, so you'll be able to find these events in both of those channels, but you can navigate our page, find a lot of really engaging content, explore more about IHL, and explore more about the American Red Cross IHL program. I want to thank everyone once again for coming along, for viewing this at some point off in the distant future. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.